Hi, everyone. Happy World Rainforest Day. My name is Kat, and I'm going to be moderating this panel today. So I work for XPRIZE, supporting communication for our climate and conservation work there, including XPRIZE Rainforest and XPRIZE Carbon Removal, the competitions that are going on right now. And I've been asked to give a short introduction to climate and conservation communication before we dive into this panel on science and storytelling. I've been working in this field for nearly a decade, which seems like a really long time. So I have so much to share, and I'm not really quite sure how to parse it down to a very quick lightning talk here in 30 seconds. But I thought that's kind of the challenge that we all have and that we'll be talking about today. How do we take something that can be complex and maybe even a little bit nebulous to the public and make it something exciting and easy to understand? So our panelists today will share some great examples for how they do this in their work, especially through storytelling, whether it's through photography, video work, social media campaigns, books. There's so many different and creative ways to share information about climate and conservation stories. And before I came to XPRIZE, I worked for many other conservation NGOs. And most recently, I was at the Smithsonian Institution working on an initiative that I hope some of you will be familiar with called Earth Optimism. And that completely shifted my style of communication, and it helped me share it, like how to be a communicator with students, early career researchers, and other science communicators. So I hope that keyword optimism will come up in this conversation pretty often today. I look forward to hearing what our panelists think about that as a tool for how to encourage people to take action instead of just take in the information on a surface level. To me, though, optimism is a little bit of a misnomer. So as we talk about storytelling today, we'll get into sharing the reality of what's happening on the ground. But if we only tell stories of doom and gloom, fires, extinctions, that makes people lose hope. And if we only share those gorgeous, lush images that look like they're out of a travel magazine, well, people will be dreaming of their next vacation. So we need to share solutions and the way that people on the ground are solving problems. It's, in a sense, optimism, but it's still grounded in the reality of what's really happening, and will hopefully make people excited and ready to take action themselves. We hope all of you will become excited and ready to take action after this panel today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll dive more into this conversation on how we can use stories to share science. Panelists, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves just in alphabetical order. I want you to tell us a little bit about where you work and how this conservation and climate communication ties into your work. So Selena, let's get started with you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Kat. Well, essentially, I call myself a storyteller, which is the name of this panel, but I'm a storyteller and an intersectional wildlife conservationist. So I kind of combine my roles as a photographer and photojournalist, as a scientist, and as an artist to harness people's empathy for change and to advocate for biodiversity. And I think the key word there is harnessing empathy. It's not shocking people out of their indifference with like the hard images that kind of plunge people into despair, but it's really kind of making sure that we connect people with nature in a way that makes them fall in love with it, and we all naturally protect what we love. I have a degree in tropical forest ecology that I studied at Imperial College London, and I focused on soundscapes because I really wanted to kind of dive into every medium of communication and storytelling. So we've got the data science, we've got the photography, we've got the storytelling, and now how can we incorporate sound into this wonderful conversation? So yeah, thank you.
Susan?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Chain. I'm one of the co-directors of Borneo Nature Foundation International. And I also oversee the IUCN section on small apes in the background. Originally from Scotland, but I've done most of my work out in Southeast Asia since, 1997. I am a conservation biologist by training. I quite substantially lack a lot of artistic ability, but I am very keen on how to bring it together. And my big focus is on how we can use technology to tell stories, to share images, as Selena said, to share sound. Gibbons sing. This is a beautiful thing that I think a lot of people don't know, that can help people empathize with them and care about them. I'm very much, I think, still at a learning curve in this, and I'm representing here for a lot of different people that do lots of work out in Indonesian Borneo for this. And I'm really keen to learn and hopefully share some of our experiences of how we're trying to use technology in particular and work with culture in the areas where we work to tell stories, to share stories, and make these available to people that might not otherwise know about them. So I'm delighted to be here. So thank you very much.
Thanks. And Sweta?
Thank you, Kat. Thank you for hosting this important conversation. Communication, storytelling, it's often dropped from these critical conversations around conservation and around how we can overcome the climate crisis more broadly. And that's unfortunate because it's a climate crisis, but we have all the tools in our toolkit. What we're really dealing with is a communications crisis. We have the human ingenuity, we have the technology, we have the evidence, the data, the stats, all of that. And yet we still find ourselves emitting more carbon than ever. And even with this increased awareness, finding ourselves in a situation where we're on a trajectory to not just not meet the Paris Accord goals, but to actually reach that max temperature warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century, maybe even sooner than that. So what are we doing wrong here? It's a communications crisis. We haven't taken the time to really understand the audience, the different audiences. We're not just one monolithic people. We need to understand how we view information, what we actually care about, what risks we perceive. And that's what I do for a living. So I'm a behavioral scientist, and I study the perceptions that human beings universally display and what influences them versus the different segments within demographics and how they vary, how different perceptions of risk vary across these segments, across different populations. And then based on that understanding, how do we communicate? Because again, the data is not going to change. The science isn't going to change. We've known what we're dealing with for decades, longer than that. So how we actually translate that information in a way that resonates with the end audience so that the end audience can act on it in a predictable way, which ideally aligns with the data and the science and what we need people to do to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to mitigate against the worst case scenarios. That's a critical conversation that needs to happen more. So I'm really pleased that you're hosting this conversation, and I look forward to contributing the role that behavioral science and the science of communicating science can play in furthering behavioral outcomes that really align to what we know to be true and the reality of the risks that we are currently facing and will continue to face in the future.
Well, I think you've given us something great to begin this conversation with. And I'm going to ask all three of you, all the panelists, I just want you to jump in. Feel free to kind of interrupt each other. Let's make this more of like a full-on conversation, so just a Q&A back and forth. I think that flows a little bit nicer. So let's talk about the challenges. What are some of the problems that we have when we're trying to translate this science into something that makes people act? What are some of the challenges that you face, and what are some of the ways that you overcome those challenges?
Well, I can just jump in and kind of bounce off of exactly what Sweta said. And I call it speaking the language of who you're speaking with, because time and time again, whether it's activists, whether it's scientists, whether photographers, I mean, we have to kind of with science communication, with conservation communication, and kind of my approach to it is bringing it into the arts and making it more than just communicating science and making it accessible, palatable, interesting, exciting, beautiful to people, and to speak to feelings and human hearts, which is kind of what data doesn't quite do. But at the same time, making sure that you're targeting a certain audience and you're making sure that you're speaking to them with the values that resonate with them and language and the numbers that resonate with them to make sure that you can have the intended outcome.
think this is fascinating. Sorry, I'd happily sit and listen to everybody else on this panel just carry on. I agree. I mean, as a scientist, I absolutely fundamentally believe we have to use good science to inform practical conservation action and the outreach and education we do. But ultimately, the way we do it as scientists is we write scientific papers. They are dull and boring. We need photos, amazing photos, sounds, videos to do this. As you're saying, Selena and Sweta, we need to understand what we're giving to people and presenting to people, and not just throwing all of this work out there, but what does it mean? Are we looking at knowledge gain and retention? Are we looking at impact assessment of what we're doing? And I think that speaks very much to what you're talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong, sorry, with the behavioral side of things, with people, and how to engage with people, and not, what we do with putting on plays and really trying to bring the conservation work into the Dayak culture where we work in Indonesian Borneo. But that's one audience. We also want people in Scotland, in the US, around the world to care about the animals that we're working with. And you're right, we talk about working with communities. A community is not a single entity with one voice, one thought, one belief. It's a complicated system of people, and that's what makes it exciting but challenging to work with. And my final thought, I think sometimes perhaps those that fund the kind of work that we're doing with the science and storytelling perhaps don't necessarily understand the nuances of the fact that, yes, okay, I can go and work with my team in a community. That's one community with a single name of a town or a village, but it's a vast group of complicated different people. And that's not an easy thing to do. And I think sometimes that's not very easily understood. So I will be quiet for now. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we can all learn from each other, absolutely, because that's the whole point. It has to be this multidisciplinary effort where we bring in the scientists, the hard scientists, those that are on the ground, those that are studying epidemiology of disease outbreaks as it relates to climate and unique features of specific parts of the world that are hotspots potentially because they're more biodiverse. We need all of that. And we need the engineers who are going to be coming up with science and technology solutions. We're going to need big barriers to prevent storm surges, right? So there's a role for engineers, of course, in confronting this massive, interconnected, complex challenge, which is the planet warming. And then we need the communicators, we need the social scientists. And that's what is the first to get cut, unfortunately, from grants or from any sort of even fundraise for companies. The communications portion is often overlooked. And that is such a key component to the success of the hard scientists. And I don't even like saying hard scientists anymore, but if we're going to have a candid conversation here, the funding is really directed towards science, technology, solutions, gathering data, gathering evidence. But for that to be successful, for the public to actually support and adopt these different innovations, for them to actually make it to market, to materialize in any way that is helpful for communities to protect themselves, to protect the nature, and to really adapt and ensure that future scenarios, worst case scenarios, are offset, we need the storytelling, we need the communicators, and we need various vehicles of presenting information, from plays to musicians to video, all of that. And I know, Kat, you're going to bring that up and get into it. So I'll wait for how to deliver communication to comment on it. But I think one of the challenges, since you asked first about challenge, is really showing that equal respect to all of the contributors that have a role to play in ensuring that the solutions that we really do have, and we're plenty more in the pipeline, are actually implemented and reach actual commercial viability. So that's where I think we're dropping the ball, and there's a lot of room for improvement there. And I think this conversation goes a long way towards that.
I agree. I think we need to prove we're doing what we say we're doing. If we say we're going to do something, we need to show that we're doing it. And I think something we're very bad at is, if we didn't do it, we need to show why. Because maybe we had the best of intentions, but something went wrong. And we need to not shy away from things not going according to plan. We need to step up to the plate and say, no, I couldn't do, or we couldn't do what we said because of, but we've monitored and evaluated, and so we can say why it didn't work. No, I think these are such important conversations. And I think something, Kat, you said at the beginning as well about quite often there's this dichotomy of, as my background, amazing animals in their natural habitat, everything's lovely and hunky-dory, or death and destruction. And people can go onto social media and see both. And there's a lot of, and Sweta and Selena, perhaps you know more about this than me, but there's a lot of work coming out in social sciences now, understanding about how people engage with, as conservationists who care, but are not perhaps involved in conservation, how they engage with it. If they see the death and destruction, does that galvanize them to action? Or does it make them go, I don't want to see this on my social media. I want to see cats and my family and my friends, and it puts them off and they don't engage with it. It's very complex. Thank you.
Why don't we talk about that then? How to get people to engage?
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, to balance off of that, I mean, we could go on forever, but the transparency in communication, especially in conservation, especially when it comes to people, if you're trying to get people to give funding, you need absolute transparency in exactly where that's going. And I also, kind of what Sweta was saying earlier, and Susan, with the communities and different audiences and getting different people involved, different stakeholders. I think one of the biggest challenges that I saw when I first entered this industry, I mean, I came from the sciences. Like, I am at heart such a nerd. Like, I love data and I love just going out, and I wish I could spend a career counting birds and looking for, fungal networks in the forest. But unfortunately, that's not something that I feel I have the time for. And just because, like, the forests are being destroyed. And one of the things that one of my professor told me, and it made me quite realize very quickly, why do we do what we do? The number of people who've dedicated their lives to conservation, who've dedicated years of research and study and sacrificing time away from family and whatnot to go out there and do all of this. Why do they do it? It's not necessarily because the forest is destroyed and etc. It's because they love it. Like my professor, we were asking him, so why did you specialize in tropical forests? Is it because they're the most biodiverse? Is it because they're the most threatened? Is it because they're like, what data can we use to explain your interest? And he just replied, I think they're really cool. So it's just, and that's kind of what I like to do with photography. It's everyone, I think, deep down has this childlike intrinsic love for nature. I mean, you go to any toddler and you kind of give them a little butterfly. It's very rare that someone would, a child is like, no, I'm not really interested in that at all. And I think it's socialized out of them. And that's kind of where social sciences comes in. But it's about tapping into this love and this joy and this hope, rather than tapping into fear and anger and pain, because that's not sustainable. And I think also one massive thing where this is really evident, where I saw when I came into this industry, was the fact that, like, I'm mixed race. I'm partly Chinese, and I grew up a little bit in China, and now I'm based in the UK, and I'm also half European. And one thing that I saw a lot in the dialogue addressing wildlife trade and conservation and all this stuff is, like, it's entirely from one perspective of one culture and very finger pointing. And that's not really how you come to a solution. That's not how you resolve issues between radically different cultures and groups of people. And so that's another huge challenge. We have a global problem before us with many, many, many different perspectives and cultural interpretations of how to do something about it and who should be doing something about it.
I know that is such a good point. Certainly within conservation, a lot is happening at the moment about decolonizing it and how we can make sure we tell the stories. I am from Scotland. I am not Indonesian. And how I make sure that I am not misrepresenting. I mean, I'm representing at the moment here over 100 people that work for Borneo Nature Foundation, who do a fantastic job, and it's amazing what they do. But I think that raises a very good point, because if we're trying to communicate something, I would argue if it seemed to be coming from the wrong place, colonialism and various other kind of platforms, people will not engage, and they shouldn't have to. And it's important, and I think especially, again, I can't speak for all all from from the UK, but there is a big colonial issue here, and there is an issue certainly with us being perceived as telling people in other parts of the world what to do. And perhaps that comes into the communication and storytelling and facilitating people to tell their own stories rather than imposing a story on someone else. It's certainly not my area of expertise, but I think it is something we need to recognize. Thanks.
Well, Selena, one of the things that you also talked about was that word hope that I was hoping the word hope would come up in this conversation so that we could talk a little bit about that and how we bring hope to people, how we get people to engage with hope. And I'm wondering if any of you have examples of stories that you've told about conservation or what's happening with our climate that you can share as, a good example of using hope as a tool to get people to engage. Sweta, do you want to go first?
Sure.
I'll hear from you in a minute.
Sure. So the behavioral science behind fear versus hope is we have a saturated information landscape, and the way we actually infiltrate people's limited cognitive attention spans is unfortunately through scary stories. That captures attention. It's why the media leans towards more negative news. It's why we see amplification of terrifying stories. Like obviously in the US, we have this unique gun culture that is making headlines all the time. Same with sensational risks like plane crashes. Same with like big natural disasters that really take out regions like wildfires and hurricanes, but less so those stories than what is perceived as man-made risks or human-made risks, I should say. So anything that is natural is considered has a lower perceived risk. And increasingly, we know that these climate impacts are not natural. These really are human caused or human accelerated, but still it's perceived as a lower risk than, let's say, an airplane crash, right? So we know this about how the brain processes and perceives information. What we also know is to mobilize action is to tell stories in a way that are truly relevant, tangible, connote urgency, and are hopeful. So people usually would respond to massive challenges with the attitude of, I'm just one person, what can I do? But we can actually provide hope by saying that there's a role you can play, you can contribute, we can overcome this, and here are ways to do it. And so my contribution to this question is obviously kind of the science underlying why hope is a true motivator for people. But also I work for a company where we would provide a tool to make it even easier. So I'm also the US president of We Don't Have Time. It's the world's largest social network. It's the world's largest review platform on climate solutions, and it's free for everyone to use. So I encourage all users that are listening to this right now that are looking to contribute and amplify effort to overcoming the climate crisis and to get into conservation and to find peers around the world to help support, accelerate, and amplify your work, to use this tool. That's the whole point of this technology. We wanted to make it available to accelerate solutions and to connect people. And when you connect with one other person, now you're a team. You connect to a third person, you're a group. And we can increase that more than any time in history because we have this technology, because we're able to connect people virtually around the world. And that is a tool that directly provides hope. It allows people to recognize that they are not just one person, but rather we are a force. And these solutions really can materialize in the real world, but we have to start somewhere and let the fear factor actually result in people paying attention to these things and also recognizing they have a role to play. And let's let technology like the We Don't Have Time platform and so many other solutions that are out there provide that hope for how we can actually scale our good efforts that are underway. What is one group doing in one part of the world that may not be connected to another, but could really support and learn from the challenges that have been faced? There's so many similar challenges transpiring all over the world. And I know Selena and Susan can talk to some specific stories, but I just wanted to set the context of this is something we want to create a platform where these stories can be told, can be supported, and can be scaled.
That is the perfect context. Let's hear some examples of some of those stories of hope. Selena, do you have one from the field you'd like to share?
Well, I do have some, but I should preface that with for every hopeful story, there are 10 very, very sad ones. But I think it's kind of like what Sweta said, is using community and finding, like allowing people to find community is an enormous key and access to hope, because it's, you're no longer one person trying to take on this enormous battle. You're now a group, you're now a community, you're now a team that you can now collectively undertake this massive project. I mean, one very hopeful story, I was working, and maybe Susan even knows about this, but this was a long time ago when I had just finished high school, and I was like a fresh out of high school. I was a child. And I was working in the Losar ecosystem, which is in Sumatra. That's an absolutely magnificent, incredible place. It's it's kind of, the last place on Earth where you have massive megafauna all coexisting in the same place. You've got Sumatran tigers, Sumatran elephants, Sumatran rhino, and orangutans all coexisting in the same habitat. And it's really the last place on Earth where you still have that. And I was working with this coalition of NGOs, Rainforest Action Network, Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program, the Save the Orangutan SOS organization. And we identified like the major threats to this ecosystem. At that time, it was one massive geothermal project. And so all hands on deck. It's very hopeful when you can kind of identify a very clear target. And this is again with the communication, the storytelling element. Sure, we can kind of spend immense amounts of money on campaigns talking about like how amazing the rainforest is and broadcast across the globe, or you can curate something that is specifically targeted to the board members of this one company that is now possibly going to be responsible for destroying 4,000 hectares of pristine rainforest. So it's a hopeful story because you've got one target, you've got a group of people coming together, mostly local conservationists coming together, and you've got targeted storytelling. And luckily we were able to take this project and take a big report with photography, with stories from locals, with everything, all the good stuff that we usually want, multimedia project, and representing it at the UNESCO World Heritage Committee and managing to ensure that it stayed this area stayed protected and had the protection of UNESCO, which is what that actually means on the ground is of course another question, but it's a hopeful story. And it again, you have to consider like there are people. I mean, I remember when I first entered this industry, within a year, I was like, I don't understand how people can do this for a decade. Like Susan, I really don't. And I know I've been there. I've, as a scientist, as a campaigner, she has to do everything. She has to be a scientist, a campaigner, a community leader, a communicator, a storyteller, lobbying, like everything all at once. And it's absolutely exhausting. And so when you have stories like this, you can also motivate not only the people members of the public who can support projects like this, but the people who are in it. And I think that is also extremely, extremely important. And that's just one example of a very clear story with a clear, hopeful outcome. But maybe Susan probably has many, many more.
Thanks. I think that's a good point. We were talking about earlier about kind of pigeonholing people into a community because of where they come from. But I think there is so much possibility that both Selena and Sweta have said that we can facilitate people to create their own community of people who are willing to take action from anywhere on the planet, from, a community who's right next to a threatened area in Indonesia to a threatened area in North America or the US or wherever. And I think that's really important. People can, if they're given the right help and support, can develop these communities. And that really is a powerful thing. I remember I spent some years growing up in Zambia, and not sure if it's a Zambian or a South American proverb, but A waterfall starts with one drop of water. And when it builds, look at the power a waterfall has. Many, many drops of water together bring the power of a waterfall to change the landscape. And I think that's really what this proverb is saying, that if you build enough momentum, change can happen. And I think there are so many important stories to tell. So just a quick couple of examples. I would say, let's not forget our old stories. Because working with the gibbons, particularly China, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, actually all the countries where gibbons exist, but China in particular, has almost 3,000 years of stories, myths, and legends, and indeed just census data about gibbons, how they fit into the culture, and the stories and traditions, and how they are considered to be important. These old stories, I think, and a project I've been working on to sort of bring these back and translate them to an audience so they can be, so people can kind of learn about them. You know, this whole thing of sort of animals being part of our mythology is not a Western concept. It probably actually happened in China well before the West even thought about it. So many amazing stories. And of course, gibbons are not the only one. There's all the myths and legends and stories and everything about Hanuman langurs in India and so many other different primates and other species. Origin myths and legends that I think are important to not lose, because in many cultures, these are not written down. There is no written or artistic evidence. These are oral traditions and stories passed down. And going from oral traditions and stories, one of the couple of things that we've done with Borneo NH Foundation is, you know, books are quite a good way of telling stories. They're not always very accessible and they can be a bit expensive. So we turned our book into an app, a free app, and you can listen to it, watch it, read it in Indonesian or English. And it's got extra content. And that's been such a sort of positive way. It's actually boosted sales of the book, strangely. But that's been an interesting way because, again, thinking about the audience, I think when it talks about the climate crisis, when I talk to kids in schools, and as young as, you know, my godson 6, they know this stuff is happening and they are worried, but they don't know what to do. They're 6. But they know that something needs to happen. And I think I would argue as scientists, as conservationists, as storytellers, we have a responsibility to reach out to that younger group who know something's happening. They don't know the details, but they're worried and scared. And we can give them hope, not sugarcoating it, not telling them the absolute worst case scenario, but I think we can give them hope in a positive way. So that would be my stories. Thank you.
I mean, can I just bounce off of that really quickly? I work with this organization called Reserva Youth Land Trust. And if that's probably the most, I don't know why my mind blanked out earlier. It's like the most hopeful story possible because it's all about empowering youth and showing young people all over the world, no matter where you're from, no matter how much money you have, you can contribute and make a tangible difference for the protection of rainforests. And so last year, or was it last year, earlier this year, I'm pretty sure within the last 12 months, we, as a small youth-led organization with a youth council of all people under the age of 26, organizing, fundraising, coming together, campaigning, raising awareness, we managed to create the world's first youth-funded nature reserve. And it's entirely a product of young people concerned about their planet, concerned about their future, concerned about nature, coming together and protecting a swathe of rainforest in the Choco region of Ecuador. And we also had this amazing campaign, and it's still ongoing. It's called the Million Letters campaign, which I think is again, really, really hopeful because it shows people that young people you don't have to be a relatively wealthy young person in the global north that has access to fundraising. You can be anybody, anywhere. If you write a letter telling us why you love nature, we donate $3 on your behalf. And that it's just kind of democratizes this idea that it's only the privileged kids our youth that have the ability to take student strikes and have the ability to fundraise in the global north that have a say and contribution to protecting rainforests everywhere. And so I think that's a really, really helpful thing.
I can add one point to this too while we're on this topic of communicating to the youth. So we know how our brains develop. This is the field of behavioral science also encompasses neuroscience. And so we know how children interpret and process information. And there is age appropriate communications. And a lot of groups like Selena, I love what you just, the example you just gave. There's a lot of groups that really apply behavioral science to ensuring that the communication being presented to different age groups really are age appropriate. So there are ways to communicate without getting into the weeds and the details of that. And more broadly to say that that's not just true for our youth, it's true across all of these different segments of different audiences, that we have to take the time to appreciate what we call mental models, but you can refer to it as risk perceptions or schemas. What is it that the audience we're communicating to understands currently? Where are the misconceptions? Where are their erroneous beliefs? Where are their alternative or culturally or politically influenced facts that are taking precedent over the science or the data? How do we course correct for that without this "we're saving you" kind of approach, but rather we are closing gaps between risk perceptions, which vary even across scientists. There's no elite group here, but rather there's variations of how people perceive information, and how do we close those variations to line better with the data? Because everyone's going to have a different background, culture, political identity. We are never going to be able to find any sort of way to broadly communicate because of the differences, and they're beautiful differences among people, but we can be much more compassionate about how we relate and translate information so that we know people are getting information to best be able to protect themselves, their communities, and the planet as a whole. And we do that through taking the time to understand existing risk perceptions and taking the time to develop strategic communications to close those perception gaps to the data, to the science, to the reality, and doing it with compassion. That is so key. Don't otherize people just because one group has one belief system that may be super intrinsic, maybe very deep in the core of their culture and their identity. The very survival of a particular of a group that has a wrong risk perception may be related to that risk perception. Maybe it might be one example. So conservatives in middle America tend to perceive lower risk of climate change and impacts of climate change. To say otherwise means you're kicked out of the group that you intrinsically identify with. And that it goes against our very nature of survival as human beings. So we have to recognize that, because we all have some example of that, and we are all wired for that. So that's the universal human quality that we all share, is we will dig our heels in to our existing beliefs just to stay part of a group that we identify with. And that's worked out for us through our evolution. It's been important to be able to be part of an in-group to ensure that we survive. Now we have to recognize that and deal with it compassionately. Any communication efforts need to take these differences in perceptions into account so we can actually give people the support they need to align their actions to the science. So I just wanted to make sure I made that point. Compassionate communication.
I want to kind of switch gears a little bit because of something else that you brought up, Sweta, which was using neuroscience to understand how to communicate to someone. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I often mentor undergraduates on science communication, and I tell them the story about how I was actually studying neuroscience as an undergrad. And that's actually what got me into science communication. I don't communicate about neuroscience, but the reason it did was because scientists were just so bad at talking about science. And obviously, present company excluded. But why is that? And then how does that path work from the scientist to the storyteller? What goes on there, and what can we share to help scientists become better communicators themselves? Do you all have any examples or anything you want to give there to the audience?
I'll go. I think sometimes we're so passionate about what we do that we kind of forget how to explain it. And I would argue there is an element of perhaps fear in standing up and kind of being out there and talking about things. When I did my very first public, it wasn't even public, in a debate at school when I was 12, I think, I was in the bathroom throwing up for like the whole hour before the English class, and I totally made a mess of it. But I didn't really know my topic, whereas now I know what I'm talking about, and I think that helps. But I wonder if, I think as scientists, we would benefit in the course of our training, from whether it's undergraduate up to, you know, PhD or whatever, about how to do this better. I mean, seriously, if you all want to stay on for the next 12 hours, I can talk about this for 12 hours. It's fine. But that's also a skill as well, is to not bore people. I think we just need that extra training, because we can be very, very passionate about what we do. But also it's about, I think, as Sweta and Selena have saying, about giving the right medium. You know, pictures speak 1,000 words. You know, instead of having to do a lot of time, say me doing an hour-long talk and translating it into multiple languages where gibbons live, because I don't speak all of them, sadly, I only speak Indonesian. Pictures can tell that much better than I can. So I think as scientists, we need more training in that, in how to sell what we do, because we are most of the time really quite passionate about it. We just don't necessarily have the best skills to be able to express that sometimes. So I think that's maybe something that would help. Thanks.
So I would add to that it doesn't have to be science. Scientists can definitely improve communication, of course. I think much of the mess we find ourselves in is definitely the poor communication of those that were doing the primary research. But we also can identify trusted spokespeople and really make sure that they have the science and the means of reaching, or they probably already have the means of reaching. So if we got Taylor Swift, okay, or Oprah, or anyone with these massive platforms that are really perceived as trustworthy, and these are influencers, celebrities, etc., to consistently translate the science, then we would be, it doesn't matter what the data says, actually. People don't care. And scientists like to say that this is the primary research, and most people are getting their information from their friends, their families, and Taylor Swift. And I'm not trying to be facetious here. There are people, we need to identify who is trusted, and we need to make sure the means that they're communicating is a trusted means, because the number one dictator in whether or not we can predict a behavioral outcome is how trusted the communicator is by the end recipient. So we can account up to 50% of the variance in decision making on whether or not to listen to this relevant science or this relevant data point, to whether or not the trust is there. And that is very upsetting sometimes for scientists to take away. But become that trusted scientist and spokesperson for your community. Otherwise, identify those that can communicate and just make sure that they are armed with credible information and allow them to do the translating.
That's really, really well said. And I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I'm learning so much from this. I'm also like taking notes on the side. But I think one of those really important things, because I went from being a scientist and, you know, on very much on the route of doing my PhD and postdoc and blah, and doing that for the rest of my life, that kind of realizing that maybe it's not necessarily the skills that you need to teach scientists. And it's kind of like what Sweta says, it's finding trusted spokespeople. And I think for me, one of the keys for storytelling, and whether that's using data to tell stories or communicating the science, it's feelings. And I often tell people I speak feelings. You can try and communicate like some of the most complex of ideas through data, through science, through lectures, and it is difficult to be interpreted and it won't get picked up. But if you tell it through a story with vulnerability, with heart, with feelings, with empathy, that engages people from a place of feelings, that it's so much more powerful and so much more convincing. And it's funny because especially as a woman and especially as a scientist, my whole life I was always told, oh, you're being too emotional, you're being too emotive, like that's not going to help your case. And I took all of that and I turned it into my strength as a storyteller. And I said, you know what, actually, I think I'm going to go full on with all of the emotions. And I think that's the route. And obviously it entirely depends on your audience, and it entirely depends on who you're speaking to, what kind of change you're trying to instigate. Because obviously, if I'm in a room full of scientists, I'm not going to talk about my feelings and my heart. And it's the same with policymakers. But when it comes to engaging people and getting people to care about something that most people have kind of forgotten or are very distant from, or a lot of people will never ever see a rainforest. How can we convey the indescribable feeling of experiencing a rainforest? It is the most biodiverse, most incredible experience, and there are no amount of words that I can tell you to why I should protect it, this data, whatnot. It's like, if you go there and you see it and you feel it, that's going to speak to you at a whole other level. And how can we do that through science or through different artistic mediums, whether that's photography, through sound, through music? I mean, have any of you tried to watch a movie without any music? You don't feel anything. So it's about combining forces with trusted spokespeople, with scientists, and with artists and social scientists.
I absolutely love that. Pulling in the emotion and the feelings is really kind of the difference between just telling the science and telling a story about the science. I really think that's like one of the key things that is a difference. And I noticed that we are kind of running out of time. This is such a good conversation. And Susan, you're right. We probably could all talk about this for 12 hours. But I wanted to give some time for the audience to ask some questions for you all. I did see that there were a couple of questions that came in through the chat and a lot of great comments. Somebody was talking about a play, writing a play to help tell a story. I thought that was incredible. What a good example of a different type of storytelling that we don't always see. Let's see if we've got any. Does anyone want to ask a question in there? We've got, there's just so much going on. Can you all see the chat? Yeah. Let me pull something out. Oh, I did see something though. A good comment about, so here's one. How do you provide alternative survival strategies to the women near the men who speak only a language that's foreign? How do you convert? It's a little bit hard for me to understand how to parse this. How do you convert greedy into breeding? I'm a little bit confused about that one, but I guess just people who are, maybe this is male dominance and trying to overcome that. And maybe that's a really great question. If we can kind of shift that a little bit. It is a male dominated field, is very like white dominated field. We talked a little bit about colonialism and conservation. So how as storytellers, all woman panel, which is really cool. How can we shift that? Do you all have any, anything you want to add in there?
I would say give, like with the myths and legends surrounding gibbons, orangutans, clouded leopards, the species that I work with. Ask people what they know, and actually possibly not what they know, what their grandparents knew or know, because that's where this idea, and again, a scientific term, local ecological knowledge, local knowledge is just, there's this wealth of information that often isn't being shared, because we're coming in with conservation at a snapshot in time. We're not often looking backwards and thinking about the information that parents, grandparents have had in the past. And a totally separate topic is concerns around sort of the loss of this. I mean, I can see this happening in the UK. My grandmother knew a lot about herbs and things like that to treat various illnesses, ailments, and things that I really don't know anything about, because that transmission of knowledge is being lost. And that's a very small example, but I think that can apply to conservation storytelling and relating back to what Selena was saying about how people feel about the forests. Many people now who live near forests, and again, I'll use the UK as an example. We have kids in inner city London who have never seen a wild space. You can't care about something if you've never seen it, you don't know it exists, you don't understand it. And that, I think, is where communication has to happen, but there is only so much that that communication can do without that immersive experience. So sorry, I'll please hand over to my fellow panelists.
I really enjoyed what you said, and talking about the loss of wisdom. I think, and that's a great place to bounce off of that, is the historical rejection of indigenous wisdom by Western modern science. Losing the rainforest is also losing cultures, is losing languages, is losing knowledge and wisdom that has been historically oppressed and actively smutted out. And now, there's an incredible book. Anyone here who hasn't read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, it's an absolute must read. She is both a botanist and a Native American woman, and talks about the necessary bonding, necessary overlap and combination of scientific knowledge and indigenous wisdom, and how that's really kind of the way forward, and how much of my experience in the scientific community was trying to figure out how to bring in, the kind of more feelings, more spiritual, more social sciences side of things into the hard sciences. And also another thing that Susan mentioned, with the gibbons and the stories and looking at all these different cultures, I think bouncing off of the original question, which is this male-dominated field. I originally, when I started out as a photojournalist and a photographer, I was like, I can do anything that a man can do. I'm going to go out and make a point out of it. Nothing fuels you more than spite. And I tried really hard. And the thing is, what I realized as I'm, engaged more and more in the field, I was like, actually, there are so many stories here that only a woman could tell. There are so many stories about women and about communities and about family and about relationships that historically weren't really covered by male journalists or male photographers or male scientists. And we've all been historically looking at this problem through whatever lens, through with science, photography, whatnot, from one perspective. And now the opportunity is, with more women in science and more women in journalism and more women in photography, it's an amazing opportunity to start opening our eyes to completely different perspectives and different stories and different solutions, which is super exciting and super hopeful. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to study ecology rather than focusing on specific species. I was like, how are they all connected? How are they interrelated? How do things rely on each other? How do things support and collaborate with each other? And I guess it's just because it's something that I felt I didn't see before. So yeah.
Well, we just got a few questions in, but unfortunately we have run out of time. This was such a great, it's all right. It's such a great conversation. I'm sure we can answer some of these questions, probably on Twitter or social media. There's lots of ways to get in touch with communicators and to ask your questions. I want to thank the audience for tuning in and for adding such great commentary on the side. And I want to thank our panelists for joining and giving such great information today on World Rainforest Day. A lot of awesome topics were covered, and I hope you all learned a lot. And I hope you all stay tuned for the rest of the sessions today.